In this video, I will explain how to find the critical path of a project that has multiple finishing activities. So let's jump right into an example. Let's say that we have some project right here. This table shows the name of each activity in the project, the predecessor to each activity, and the duration of each activity. So the first step is let's just draw a rough sketch of this network diagram. So we can see that activity A has no predecessor. So that's going to be our initial activity. Let's write an A right here. Now we can see that activity B and C both have a predecessor of activity A. So that means activity A leads into both of those activities. So let's go ahead and draw an arrow from A to B and an arrow from A to C. Then we can see that activity D and E both have a predecessor of activity B. So let's go ahead and draw an arrow from B into activity D and activity E. Then for activity F, it has a predecessor of C. So let's draw an arrow from C to F. Then activity G has a predecessor of D and E, so we'll draw an arrow from D and E to activity G. And lastly, activity H has predecessors E and F. Let's draw an arrow from E and F into activity H. So we can see for this particular project, there's two finishing activities. In other words, two activities that have no other activities that come after them. So let's go ahead and formalize this diagram by using boxes that look like this. So for each of these boxes, we're going to write the activity name, the duration of the activity, and then the early start, early finish, and late start and late finish of each activity. So let's go ahead and start sketching this out. Okay, so I've gone ahead and written down the activity name and the duration of each activity. Now let's use the forward pass method to find the early start and the early finish of each activity. So for the first activity A, the early start is just going to be 0. To find the early finish, we take the early start and we add the duration. So 0 plus 2 is 2. So the early finish for activity A is 2. Now we take this 2 and we move it into the early start for the activities that follow it. So for B and C, they both will get an early start of 2. And we just repeat the process. So for activity B, the early finish will be 2 plus 5, which is 7. For activity C, we have 2 plus 3, which is 5. Then again, take this early finish for activity C and move it into the early start of the activity that comes after it. So for F, it will get an early start of 5. For activities D and E, we're going to take this 7, this early finish of activity B, and move it into the early start for activity D and E. And we'll repeat the process again. So for activity D, the early finish will be 7 plus the duration of 1, which is 8. For E, we have 7 plus 4, which is 11. For F, we have 5 plus 2, which is 7. Now, for these final two activities, this becomes a little interesting because notice for activity G, we have activity D and E that lead into it. So for activity D, we have an early finish of 8. For activity E, we have an early finish of 11. So should we take the 8 or the 11 to go into the early start for activity G? Well, when we're doing forward pass, we always take the larger of the values. And the reason is because, remember, for activity G to begin, both D and E have to finish up. And this tells us even if activity D finishes on day 8 at the earliest, we still have to wait all the way until day 11 for activity E to finish up. So that's why we take the larger of the two values. So we'll say the earliest that activity G can start is on day 11. And we use the same logic for activity H. So we can see that activity E and F lead into it. So again, we look at the early finish days and we say, should we take the 7 or the 11? Well, we always choose the larger value, so we'll take the 11. So the earliest that activity H could start is also day 11. And lastly, for activity G, the earliest it can finish is 11 plus 3, which is 14. And for activity H, the earliest it can finish is 11 plus 2, which is 13. So that completes our forward pass. So we found the early start and early finish of each activity. Now we're going to use the backward pass method to find the late start and the late finish of each activity. Now the first thing we do is that we look at the early finish values, so 14 and 13, and we take the larger of those two values to place into the late finish for both of the final activities. So we'll put a 14 here, and we'll put a 14 right here. Now to find the late start of an activity, just take the late finish and subtract the duration. So for activity G, that would be 14 minus 3, which is 11. For activity H, that would be 14 minus 2, which is 12. Then take the late start of an activity and move it into its preceding activity for the late finish. So for activity F, we'll put a 12 right here. Then for activity E, we can see that there are two arrows that connect it to activity G and H. So the question is, should we bring in the late start of 12 or the late start of 11 into this late finish position? Well, when we're doing the backward pass, we always choose the minimum value. So we're going to choose the 11 in this case. So we'll put an 11 right here for the late finish. And for activity D, we can see that there's only one arrow that connects it to G. So we're just going to take the late start and put it into the late finish position for activity D. So we'll put an 11 right here as well. Then we'll repeat the process where we take the late finish and subtract the duration. So 11 minus 1, that's 10. For activity E, we have 11 minus 4, which is 7. And for activity F, we have 12 minus 2, which is 10. Then we'll take this 10 and we'll move it into the late finish position of the preceding activity. So we'll put a 10 right here. Now for activity B, we have two choices. We can take the 10 or the 7 for the late finish. And remember, when we do backward pass, we always take the smaller of the values. So we'll bring a 7 in here. Then we'll repeat the process where we do 7 minus 5 to get 2 for the late start. For activity C, we have 10 minus 3, which is 7. And lastly, for activity A, should we take the late start of 2 or the late start of 7 to put into this late finish position? Well, again, always take the smaller of the two values. So we'll choose the 2. So we'll put a 2 right here. And lastly, we do 2 minus 2, which is 0 for late start for activity A. So that completes our backward pass. Now, once we've reached this point, we have all the information that we need to find the critical path. So the critical path is simply going to be all of the activities where the late finish is equal to the early finish, or equivalently where the late start is equal to the early start. Either method you can use is fine. It will produce the same answer. For this example, let's just identify the activities where the late finish is equal to the early finish. So we can see that would be activity A, B, E, and G. So let's go ahead and write that down. And what that tells us is that if any of these activities on our critical path are delayed, even by 1 day, it would increase the duration of the entire project. But the same is not true of the activities that are not on the critical path. So activities C, D, F, and H, for all of these, we'll notice that there's a little bit of wiggle room. So for these activities, they can be delayed by a certain number of days without increasing the duration of the entire project. So that is how you can find the critical path of a project where there are multiple finishing activities.